And starting us out at number 10, we have Shrink. This quick play spell targets a face-up monster in the field and halves its original attack until the end of this turn. Shrink is probably one of the first cards to come to anyone's mind when they hear the word battle trick. It will always allow reasonably statted monsters to win pretty much every battle, and can be used both when attacking and being attacked. One of the biggest upsides of this over something like Sakuretsu Armor is that it can be activated during the damage step, where most kinds of effects cannot be activated, letting it get under a lot of usual defensive options. Shrink single-handedly power crept Rush Recklessly, which increased a monster's attack by 700, and replaced it entirely in all decks that wanted to run the card. At the time of its release, that was most commonly Gadgets, because they had just enough attack to trade with 1 tribute monsters after a Shrink. It was yet another piece of 1-for-1 removal in a deck that really maxed out on these. Shortly afterwards, it became a staple in Gladiator Beast decks, as their monsters all needed to have battled that turn to activate their effects, meaning that battle traps that removed monsters or negated attacks were just not that good. For that reason, many lists would opt to run cards like Shrink and Waboku instead, which made it extra dangerous for your opponent to attack into your monsters, as you'd then be able to use the tag out Glads during your opponent's battle phase too. And this is kind of where Shrink's usage ended. There wasn't really any deck after Gladiator Beast that would be better off using other battle traps, and even in there, players would eventually prefer to run more versatile back row, like Bottomless Trap Hole or Compulsory Evacuation Device. Not that big of a showing for Shrink, but that's just how we're going to start this list out. And coming in at number 9, we have Necro Gardna. This is a level 3 Dark Warrior that, as a quick effect, can banish itself during your opponent's turn to negate their next attack. Gardna was the first good battle stopper activatable straight from your graveyard, and one of the first good generic graveyard effects we got in the game overall. This card would go on to be played on all sorts of mill and graveyard-centered decks for the foreseeable future, to the point where it was even limited on the ban list for a while. Dark Toolbox decks centered around Dark Arm Dragon would play it, since Dark Grepher and Armageddon Knight are both really easy ways to send it straight from the deck to the graveyard. Lightsworns loved it as well because all their monsters ended up milling for you for some amount, letting you sometimes get a free Gardna out in the graveyard. While yes, differently from a set back row, your opponent can see the Necro Gardna and play around it better than some unknown face-down card, having it available almost for free without being vulnerable to removal more than made up for it though. And while they can see it's there, you'll still need to field multiple attacks to really make up for it. Old decks often would not have enough swarming power to flood a board just like that, making it very effective at protecting small monsters, especially in the early game. It also pretty much guarantees you won't die in a given turn, since you can always cancel the strongest attack your opponent has going through. Gardna was a deceptively strong part of any mill deck all the way until 2015, when Electromagnetic Turtle came out, which banishes itself from the graveyard to end your opponent's battle phase instead. Still, despite being power crept eventually, it's still a huge achievement that Gardna saw play for as long as it did. And now for number 8, there's Threatening Roar. This normal trap makes it so that your opponent cannot declare an attack this turn. Out of all the cards in this list, none of them are better at stopping an OTK from going through than Threatening Roar. It's chainable, meaning that back row removal won't stop its effect from going off, and just blanket protects you for a whole turn. It's also very much similar to the older Waboku, except it has the upsides of making your opponent unable to trigger effects that can only happen during attacks. Threatening Roar saw a lot of play in old explosive formats, such as Tier 0 Dad and Insectors. While these decks could kill you very easily, they couldn't really build a board to stop you from playing on your following turn. So skipping their battle phase was a great way to do a reversal and OTK them instead. Later on, it'd also become a decent option in Paleozoics as a chainable trap card that both keeps you and your Paleos alive. Threatening Roar has even been seen a small amount of play in the modern format as something you can tutor from Thrust and Trap Trick against Tenpai Dragon. Tenpai functions much like old school OTK decks in that it's really good at killing you in one turn, but sucks at making a board of its own, making this a pretty valid option. Against a deck that can deal upwards of 36,000 damage during the battle phase, anything short of stopping them from attacking entirely is just not going to be enough. And at number 7, we have Magic Cylinder. This is a normal trap that targets an opponent's attacking monster, negates the attack, and then inflicts damage to your opponent equal to that monster's attack. As far as being a battle trick goes, Magic Cylinder is quite mediocre. I mean, yeah, it deals with the attack, but it doesn't really deal with the monster, meaning next turn, they'll be ready to bash you with it again. However, Cylinder excels at being a burn card, and one of the best game enders that burn decks can have access to. Back in classic Yu-Gi-Oh, you'd even see this card being ran in non-burn decks as a very cheesy way of ending games. You get into a grind game with an opponent, and then they'd finally get the upper hand and manage to establish a big monster, only for you to get surprised and get KO'd by this instead. The inherent sackiness this card had made it very much like Ring of Destruction back in the day, something that could turn a one game into a loss by itself. Konami would handle it accordingly then and limit Cylinder to 1 for a really long time. Once the card pool widened a bit and we got better and better things to use during the battle phase, Cylinder would be mostly confined to decks like Chainburn. In the future, it even gets some legacy support with Magic Cylinders, a card which both sets it from the deck and doubles the damage it does, though it also kinda defeats the point of the card if your opponent knows you have one set. And even if it might not be the scariest game ender it once was, you've probably been hit by a Cylinder at least once if you've climbed the Master Duel ladder. And at number 6, there's Enemy Controller. This is a quick play spell that lets you choose between two effects. Either target an opponent's monster and change its battle position, or tribute one of your monsters to take control of an opponent's monster until the end of the turn. Econ was one of the first modal spells the game saw, and it was a pretty good one at that. Either of its effects wouldn't really be good enough to see play individually, but when you have access to both, you get one of the most versatile cards the game has ever seen. It is true that the first effect, the one that actually qualifies as a battle trick, was always seen as the worst one. Still, that doesn't mean it couldn't be useful at times. One, if its best uses was changing monarchs to defense position, as their paltry 1000 defense would allow them to get beaten over by basically anything. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it can also be used as a last resort to stop a Zeus play from happening. But yeah, the meat and bones of Econ was definitely the steal effect. The original combo was to tribute a Treeborn Frog during the standby phase to take an opponent's monster. And since Treeborn Frog was not a hard once per turn, it would just come right back again. This lets you set up double tributes while also removing an opponent's monster, which is a massive tempo swing. There's just a lot of value in stealing an opponent's monster, especially when the tribute cost lets you dodge all kinds of targeted removal and negation effects. This let the card see play in decks such as BA, Zodiacs, and even Kashtira. While it never got hit in the TCG, it saw enough play in Duel Links to be limited 2 for several years, and even got put down to 1 in recent times. However, while Econ might be one of the most popular cards in here, only qualifying due to its consolation effect has knocked it down a peg on this list. And at number 5, we have Sakuretsu Armor. This normal trap can be activated when an opponent's monster declares an attack, and then it targets and destroys that monster. Sakuretsu might be one of the most fair cards to ever see play in the history of the game. It's a simple 1-for-1 removal that targets and destroys with no additional effects or costs. This is, of course, terrible now, but that was enough to make it one of the most played staples in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Pretty much any control deck played this card to some capacity, as it's just a really efficient way to deal with basically any monster in these formats. The monsters with actual good effects such as Monarchs and Chaos guys don't really have any protection whatsoever, and so your Sakuretsu could deal with these already resolved threats pretty well. Even floatier monsters such as Recruiters would have to think twice before attacking, because they only floated when destroyed by battle and not by card effects. It was also imperative to have it for defense against monsters that could shred your hand on direct attacks like Don Zalug and Spirit Reaper. Sakuretsu was a great card overall, and since background removal was somewhat limited back then, with MST and Heavy Storm both being at 1, no one would bat an eye if you maxed out on Sakuretsu in almost any given deck. Some even chose to play Widespread Ruin as additional copies of Sakuretsu Armor too. Ironically enough, being a side grade that's only really played when you're already maxed out on another card is exactly the same niche that Sakuretsu would fit itself in when it got power crept by this next card. And at number 4, we have Dimensional Prison. Much like the previous spot, this card targets an opponent's monster when it attacks, except it then banishes that target instead. The difference between banishing and destroying cannot be understated. There's a very clear reason why Sakuretsu stopped seeing play towards the end of 2007, while Dimensional Prison continued to be a staple all the way until 2015. The added value of banishing the monster made it work way better against cards that use the graveyard as a resource, such as Chaos and Dad. It also got around basically all of the floating effects that were relevant at the time. The graveyard being a second hand is something that has been true in Yu-Gi-Oh! For a really long time, and decks became more and more reliant on it as time went on. That's how you could justify running this reactive, slow card all the way until 2015. If it resolved, the monster got outed and was not coming back. Destruction protection was starting to become a thing around the time this card was released too, and being a trap that just traded cleanly with Stardust Dragon was huge. Even the preferred XCs too played into back row back then. Wind-up Zen mains would also get annihilated when facing the deep prison. Heck, even mighty boss monsters like Dante and Construct would have to think twice before hitting into back row if there was a chance of it being there. Unlike Sakuretsu, it eventually earned itself a place on the ban list too, even if it was just a semi-limit for a short while. To top it all off, this card was initially a video game exclusive, so just imagine how much of a pain it was to get a playset of it on release. And at number 3, we have Book of Moon, a quick play spell that targets and then flips a monster in the field face down. Book might not be the oldest card in this list, but it's also the most played one by far. It feels a bit of a disservice to even call it a battle trick, since being able to flip down a monster that are either attacking or being attacked into to win combat is a small aspect of why this card is so good. However, at the same time, it does add to Book's versatility, and that's the main thing this card has going for itself. Even within GOAT format, which is set in 2005, this card has a lot of utility. You can play it to reuse your flip effects, beat over threats with low defense, or dodge a Chaos Sorks effect. You even have access to one of the strongest plays in the format, booking down your Thousand Eyes Restrict and then flipping it back up so it can suck up another monster. But it wouldn't stop at that, as this card would continue seeing play throughout the years, aging like fine wine. Cyber Dragon heralded the end of GOAT format, and God knows 1600 defense is easier to deal with than 2100 attack. It fit like a glove in Gladiator Beast, as it was a great way to stop or force attacks through. Come the release of Synchros, and Book can now flip down opponents' tuners to stop them from accessing the extra deck too. By the time the XCs were released, this card was seen play in basically every deck and had to be limited, but that only made it feel like even more of an auto-include. Need to deal with a problematic monster like Unicorn or Winda? Just book it. Opponent ended on an annoying boss monster like Dryden or a Riseheart? This card from 2 decades ago clears it. The fact that Book of Moon managed to be one of the most played cards in various formats in playing 2023 is a testament to how it beat the test of time, and the only reason it can't be number 1 is due to how good the next 2 cards are during the battle phase, even if Book might be better outside of it. And now for number 2, we've got Honest. This is a level 4 light fairy, and its on-field effect says you can return it back to your hand during your main phase. However, while it's in the hand, while a light monster you control battles, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard to give your monster attack equal to your opponent's monster's attack until the end of the turn. Honest is one of the first meta hand traps we ever got, and even if it might not function like modern hand traps do, I can guarantee getting hit by an unexpected Honest was just as bad as the timely Nibiru. The main benefit of Honest is just how extremely difficult it is to play around. Unlike other battle traps, you don't have to set it on the field before using it. So, as long as you have a light monster in attack position and a card in hand, you can be representing an Honest. Plus, it can be dropped straight during damage calculation, a window in which no other battle tricks will be able to interact with. Honest is just straight up an I win button for combat when it comes to light decks, and it being released alongside Lightsworns is certainly one of the reasons why the old archetype was good for as long as it was. You can even use it offensively to go for game too. By honesting over a monster, not only are you removing a threat, you're also damaging your opponent for at least as much attack as your monster has. Pair it with a big monster attacking over a smaller one, as well as maybe a second or third Honest since it's not a once per turn, and you've got the reason why this card had to be limited. Another big thing about Honest is that despite being a battle trick, it's also a body, and an incredibly relevant one at that. 1900 defense is just enough for it to soak some pressure if it's all you've got around, and then you can just bounce it back to your hand once you've drawn into more monsters. It's also a fairy, which meant not only did it contribute to getting an Archlord Christie alive, it was also a target to get it back once you did. Even if modern archetypes wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole, this was once an auto-include in every light-based deck, from Boojins to Trickstars, and for this reason, it deserves to be high on this list. And finally, at number 1, we have Mirror Force. Everybody already knows, but Mirror Force is a trap that can be activated when an opponent's monster declares an attack, and it destroys all attack position monsters they control. This card is so iconic, it'd be impossible to have it anywhere but at number 1. Be it from playing the game or watching the anime, everyone knows how devastating it is to be hit by an unexpected Mirror Force. Limited from its very release, this card was one of the big bombs you had to be playing around at all times, ranking up there with Torrential Tribute. With so few good spell trap removals to go around back then, your best shot was often to switch some monsters to defense position before going to the battle phase, just to ensure you wouldn't get blown out by a Mirror Force. a tactic as ingrained into retro players' minds as attacking lowest to highest due to gores, or setting just a single back row in fear of Heavy Storm. For a really long time, this was just an auto-include in every deck, only taking a break every so often when the format was really degenerate. Every Goat and Edison decks you find will be on that single copy, save for a very few select exceptions. It's just a really solid non-targeting removal option that often trades at least 2 for 1. Even as we got more monsters that could deal with Mirror Force like Stardust Dragon and Wind Up Zenmaines, it was still worth playing, as it's not like your opponent would always be able to go into those. It took MST going to 3 and a ton of extra power creep for people to start going off this card, and even then, it wouldn't disappear completely just like that. You can find tops playing this card for every month of the year up until 2015 or so, where it would start falling off, because that was also when we began to get some very good Mirror Force retrains, those being Storming, Quaking, and Drowning, all of which also saw play too. Even as far as 2017 with Zodiacs and Paleos wrecking havoc, you could still find people sleeving up a trusty Mirror Force from the 2002 to surprise an opponent with. Mirror Force is a card that has impacted the game like few others ever could, and it's reached such legendary status that it could only be rivaled by Monster Reborn when it comes to iconic cards. So where else should it be if not number 1 on this list? Alright, and that's the list. If you know of any other cards you may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one, please let us know down in the comments below.